My name is Velsarin of the 8th House of Dorith, and I have served as Chief Proctor of the Tribunal of Minds for 4,000 cycles without incident. I say this not to boast. I say it because when you hear what happened in my chamber on the day the human walked in, I want you to understand that I am not the kind of official who exaggerates. I have never filed a dramatic report. I have never requested an emergency review. I have never once, in 4 millennia of service, reached across my console and turned on the signal that summoned senior members of the Concordance Bureau to observe a live examination in real time. I turned it on that day. The alert came in the ESA early morning cycle, when my junior staff were still settling into their stations and the chamber itself was still warming its internal lattice. A candidate had arrived, unscheduled, which was unusual, unenhanced, which was nearly unheard of, and human, which caused my youngest assistant, a creature named Piril, who had barely completed her second molt, to actually spit her morning drink across her console. I read the file quietly. Her name was Sarah Danforth, 41 years old by her planet's calendar. She had spent the last 16 years of her life working as a nurse in a hospital on a continent her people called North America. Before that, she had studied what humans called biology, and before that, she had, according to her early records, spent 3 years caring for her younger siblings after the death of both parents. She had no neural mesh, no cognitive accelerators, no chemical memory enhancement of any recognized variety. She had not been selected by her civilization as a candidate. She had, as far as the Bureau could determine, simply applied. On her own. Through the public registration portal that technically any species in the Concordance could access, though no unsponsored candidate had used it in over 8,000 cycles. Her application form, in the field marked Reason for Applying, contained 4 words. I want to know. I heard Piril and my other assistant, a male named Doss, exchanging murmured sounds behind me, the kind of murmurs that carry bets inside them. I did not turn around. I was still reading the species attachment clipped to the back of Sarah Danforth's file, the standard first contact behavioral summary the Bureau required for all non-concordance candidates. The summary was unusual. Most species files used clean clinical language, tends toward logic, responds well to structured challenges, requires emotional regulation support in high-stress environments. The human file read more like something a worried parent had written about a child they both admired and did not entirely understand. Humans operate effectively under conditions of extreme uncertainty. They show elevated performance in crisis situations compared to controlled ones. They form attachments rapidly and use those attachments as fuel for sustained effort. They do not reliably recognize when they are supposed to stop. They have a documented tendency to reframe failure as information. That last line had been flagged with a small marker that indicated the first contact officer had found it significant enough to note twice. I closed the file. I straightened my observation sash. I went to meet her. She was standing in the intake corridor, which was a long, pale hallway designed to feel slightly cold and slightly too large, intended to remind candidates of their smallness before they even reached the chamber. It worked on every species we had ever processed. They all walked it with their shoulders drawn inward and their eyes moving carefully along the walls. Sarah Danforth was standing in the middle of it, reading a small paper notice posted near the entrance that listed the tribunal's rules of conduct. She had a silver thermos tucked under one arm and a soft gray notebook held in her other hand, already open, already written in. She looked up when I approached. She had light brown skin and dark eyes, and the particular expression of a person who is genuinely interested in where they are. She said, "This place is much bigger than the photographs." I told her I was not aware there were photographs. She said, "There are always photographs." I introduced myself. I told her I was Chief Proctor and that I would be overseeing her examination. She shook my secondary hand, which startled me because most first-time human visitors did not know which of my limbs was appropriate for greeting. She seemed entirely unbothered by my appearance, which covered 8 limbs, a carapace of deep amber, and 4 sets of eyes arranged in a vertical line across my upper face. She asked if we could begin. I walked her through the rules the way I had walked 40,000 candidates through them before her. The Tribunal of Minds contained 9 sections. Each section tested a different architecture of sapient thought. She could attempt them in any sequence. The internal chamber clock would give her 96 subjective hours. The external clock would barely move. If she wished to stop at any point, she needed only to speak the word release and the chamber would return her immediately, safely, with no record of failure, only withdrawal. She listened. She took one small note. When I finished, she asked me one question. She did not ask about her odds. She did not ask which sections were hardest. She did not ask what the passing score meant for her people's standing in the concordance, which was the question every sponsored candidate had asked in one form or another for 4,000 cycles. She asked, "Is there anything alive in the chamber? Any part of it that thinks?" I considered the question carefully. I told her that the chamber's evaluation lattice had something close to responsiveness, a kind of deep, slow attention that was not quite consciousness, but was also not nothing. She nodded as if this mattered to her. She said, "Then I will try to be polite to it." She walked through the door. The chamber sealed, the lattice lit. I returned to my observation station and sat down and pulled up her internal display, and Pirrell and Doss settled in beside me with the casual posture of people expecting to spend perhaps 3 or 4 subjective hours watching a candidate struggle before calling the withdrawal. Section 1 appeared on the chamber walls. It was called the Architecture of Cause, and it presented the candidate with a chain of reasoning 40 statements long, each built upon the last, in which the foundational assumptions had been deliberately buried so deep beneath layers of apparent logic that most minds never found them. The purpose was to test whether a candidate could identify not just what was wrong with an argument, but where precisely the error had been planted, and what kind of error it was. The record for Section 1 was held by a scholar monk of the Erethean order who had trained for 60 years specifically to pass this exam. He had completed it in 14 internal hours. Sarah Danforth read the first statement. She read the second. She opened her notebook and wrote something down with a pen she produced from her shirt pocket. She said out loud, to no one in particular, "Okay, so the trick is in Statement 4. Everything after that is just consequences." Pirrell made a small, involuntary sound. Sarah kept talking to herself as she worked, in a low murmur that my translator caught and rendered faithfully. She said things like, "Right, okay, that follows," and "No, wait, that doesn't land, backtrack," and once, very quietly, "Oh, you sneaky little thing." She laughed once, a short, bright sound, at a particular turn in the argument, as if she had spotted a joke the writers hadn't known they'd made. She finished Section 1. The internal clock read, 22 minutes. I looked at the clock. I looked at the display. I looked at the green pass indicator glowing steadily across all 9 evaluation metrics for Section 1. Doss said very quietly that there must be a calibration error. I told him, also very quietly, to run the calibration. Check. He ran it. The system was functioning perfectly. Sarah Danforth was already reading Section 2. Section 2 was the logic collapse. It had been designed by a consortium of the Concordance's finest structural philosophers over a period of 2,000 cycles. It presented the candidate with a system of rules that was internally consistent in every measurable way, but that produced, when followed completely, an outcome that was morally and practically impossible. The candidate was required to identify and articulate what had gone wrong. Most candidates spent enormous effort trying to find the flaw within the rule system itself. They dissected each rule. They tested combinations. They built elaborate logical models trying to locate the precise moment the system broke. The system never broke from within. That was the point. The flaw was not inside the rules. The flaw was that the rules had been written by someone who had made a single unspoken assumption about the nature of the beings who would follow them, an assumption so fundamental that it had never been stated aloud because the writers had never imagined a mind that didn't share it. Sarah read the system. She read the outcome it produced. She was quiet for perhaps 2 minutes. Then she wrote a single paragraph in her notebook, tore the page out, and pressed it against the chamber wall where answers were recorded. The evaluation lattice considered it. The green light came on. I pulled up her answer through the back channel. I knew I should not. I read it anyway. She had written, "The rules assume that the beings following them want what the rules say they should want. Remove that assumption and the system works fine. The problem isn't the logic. The problem is that somebody forgot to ask the people involved what they actually needed." I sat with that for a long moment. Behind me, both Pirrell and Doss had gone completely still. The external clock had not moved, not once, not by a single fraction of a second. I reached across my console. I turned on the emergency signal. The observation board arrived in pieces. First came 2 junior analysts from the Bureau's Cognition Division, who took one look at Sarah's progress display and began speaking to each other in the clipped, rapid tones of people who have just realized they are in the wrong category of situation entirely. Then came a senior examiner named Rath Koval, who had overseen 12,000 candidate examinations in her career and who stood at the edge of my station for a full minute without speaking before she said very carefully that she wanted to see the calibration logs. I gave them to her. She read them. She said nothing. Sarah was already inside Section 3. Section 3 was called the grief engine. I had always considered it the most honest section of the tribunal, which was perhaps why it was also the most damaging. The chamber did not generate false emotions. It drew on its archive of real ones, a collection built across 40,000 cycles from the recorded experiences of actual beings at actual moments of actual loss. It then delivered those experiences into the candidate's mind, not sequentially, not gently, but all at once. The grief of a Vressel parent who had outlived every one of her children. The loneliness of an Arethian elder whose entire philosophical tradition had died with his generation. The quiet, unspectacular sorrow of a being who had simply spent too long hoping for something that never came. The purpose was not cruelty. The purpose was to determine whether a mind could hold the weight of others without either shutting down or dissolving entirely. The great paradox of compassion, that to feel it fully was to risk being destroyed by it, and to protect yourself from it was to lose the thing that made you worth saving. We had seen candidates approach this section in many ways. The shielding method always failed. The cataloging method always failed. A Brennan Hive adept had once tried to distribute the grief across the collective consciousness of her entire home world through a neural relay, which had worked technically but had caused a minor emotional disturbance across 40 million beings simultaneously. So we had since banned relay devices. Sarah sat down in the center of the chamber. She set her thermos beside her. She put her notebook in her lap and held her pen loosely, not writing, just holding it. She closed her eyes. The grief engine began. Watched her face through the lattice feed. I had watched many faces during this section. I had learned to read the signs of what was happening inside a mind from the small movements of expression. The tightening around the eyes, the particular way a mouth changes shape when it is holding something it did not agree to carry. Sarah's face did not tighten. It did something I had never seen in 4,000 cycles. It softened, not in the way of someone going slack or losing focus, in the way of someone who has just been handed something precious and is being careful with it. She breathed slowly. Her hands stayed still. After perhaps 10 minutes of subjective time, which was far faster than any mind had ever survived the first wave of the engine, she opened her eyes and began, very quietly, to write in her notebook. Rath Koval leaned forward. Behind me, she asked what the candidate was doing. I told her I did not know. Sarah wrote for what the internal clock measured as 40 minutes. She filled several pages. Then she closed the notebook, placed her hand flat on the cover, and sat quietly for a moment, longer. The evaluation lattice resolved. Green across every metric. A score in the 94th percentile, the highest any being had ever achieved on Section 3. I reached through the back channel again. I read what she had written. She had not tried to process the grief. She had not tried to categorize it or contain it or push through it. She had written about each grief the way a person writes a letter to someone they will never meet. She had named things she recognized. She had said in plain language, "I know this one. I have felt something like this. You are not alone in it, wherever you are. She had treated the archived sorrows of 40,000 years of recorded suffering as if they were individual people who deserved to be acknowledged, and she had simply acknowledged them, one by one, for as long as it took. I set down the readout. My hands were not entirely steady. Rathkovel said very quietly that she had never seen that approach in her entire career. I told her I hadn't either. Sarah was already opening Section 4. Section 4 was the infinite regression, and it was the one I had always privately considered the tribunal's most elegant cruelty. It presented the candidate with a philosophical proposition and then asked them to justify it. When they provided a justification, the section asked them to justify the justification, and then to justify that, and so on until the candidate was either forced to admit that no belief could ultimately justify itself without circular reasoning, which produced an existential paralysis most minds could not recover from easily, or until they simply could not continue and withdrew. The trap was not the regress itself. The trap was that the section was designed to make the candidate feel that stopping was failure, that the inability to justify a belief infinitely meant the belief was worthless. 3 of the Concordance's senior philosophical orders had produced formal arguments against this section's inclusion in the tribunal on ethical grounds. They had lost those arguments because the section's designers had used the section's own structure to defeat the objections. It had been considered very clever at the time. I had always found it somewhat smug. Sarah read the opening proposition. She wrote 1 round of justification. Then she stopped and wrote 2 sentences at the bottom of the page and pressed the answer sheet to the wall. I read it before the green light even finished resolving. She had written, "This can go forever, and that's all right. I don't need the ground to go down to the center of the earth to trust that it will hold me up." Rathkovel actually laughed, a short, startled sound she immediately controlled. She pressed one hand against her upper face and shook her head slowly. Sarah was drinking from her thermos. She shook it and seemed to find it nearly empty. She looked at it with the expression of someone making peace with a minor disappointment, and set it aside. She picked up her notebook and her pen. She walked to Section 5. I will not detail every remaining section at the length the earlier ones deserve, partly because what happened in them would fill 3 separate volumes, and partly because this account is already long enough. What I will tell you is this. In Section 5, which tested the capacity to hold contradictory truths simultaneously without resolving them prematurely, she spent 18 minutes and described the experience afterward in her notebook as being apparent, which none of us fully understood but which apparently expressed the condition precisely enough for the lattice to score it at a near-perfect rating. In Section 6, which constructed a scenario in which every available action produced harm and asked the candidate to act anyway, she chose an action and wrote beside it, "This is wrong and I am doing it because the alternative is doing nothing, and doing nothing is also a choice and I will not pretend otherwise." The lattice held that answer for a long moment before the green light came on. I think, in its slow, deep way, the chamber had needed a moment to consider it. In Sections 7 and 8, she worked quickly and without drama, making small comments. In her notebook the way she had done at the beginning. "This one is interesting. I have seen this before in different clothes. Whoever built this was angry about something when they wrote it." Section 9 was the last one. It was called The Silence, which was not a poetic name but a literal one. The chamber went entirely dark. All stimulus ceased. No light, no sound, no projected text, no evaluation prompts. The candidate was left alone with their own mind in conditions of complete sensory removal, and the section did not end on a timer. It ended when the candidate produced a response, the nature of which was entirely up to them. Most candidates broke in the silence. Not dramatically. Quietly. They began to speak, or to move, or to make any sound at all, because the human need, and it was not only a human need, it was a need of nearly every sapient species, to reach outward, to confirm that the world still existed and they still existed within it, became unbearable. The section was not testing endurance. It was testing what a mind reached for when everything external was removed. What it found inside itself, whether there was enough there to sustain it. Sarah sat in the dark for what the internal clock measured as 11 minutes. Then she began to hum, softly. A simple repeating melody that my translator identified as a human tune of the lullaby category, the kind sung to children. She hummed it quietly to herself in the dark, and the chamber lattice listened to every note. And when she finished the last repetition, she said also softly and also to herself, "All right. Still here." And she stood up. The chamber lights came on. The evaluation lattice resolved across every metric, one by one, in a slow cascade of green that took nearly 20 seconds, and that the senior examiner Rathkovel watched in complete silence. The Dacker opened. Sarah Danforth walked out into the intake corridor. She was carrying her empty thermos and her full notebook. Her hair had come slightly loose from where she tied it. She looked tired in the way a person looks tired after a long day of work they believed in. She looked at me. She said, "Well, how did I do?" I told her. It took me a moment to find the right way to begin. I told her she had achieved the highest aggregate score in the recorded history of the Tribunal of Minds. I told her she had completed all 9 sections in what amounted to, by the external clock, less than 4 seconds of real time. I told her that the Bureau was already convening an emergency session, and that her results would change the Concordance's understanding of what sapient cognition could be, and possibly what the Tribunal itself was actually for. She listened carefully. She nodded at each point. Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" I told her yes. She said, "The part in section 3, the grief part, did those feelings belong to real people? Real beings?" I told her they did. She was quiet for a moment. She held her notebook a little more carefully. She said, "I hope I did right by them." I told her I believed she had. She nodded. She looked down at her empty thermos. She looked back up at me and said, "I could really use a coffee." I did not know what to say to that, so I said I would see what could be arranged. And I walked her toward the Bureau's small reception area, and Pirrell ran ahead to find something appropriate. And Rathkovel walked quietly beside me and said nothing for a long time. Then Rathkovel said, "She went in to find out if she could." I said yes. Rathkovel said, "She was never trying to pass." I said, "No, I don't think she was." We walked in silence the rest of the way. Behind us, the chamber was already being reviewed by a committee of 9 analysts who would spend the next several cycles trying to understand what had happened inside it. Ahead of us, Sarah Danforth was talking to Pirrell, asking her something about the building's architecture, genuinely curious, tilting her head the way she had done at the very beginning. She had walked in wanting to know. She had walked out knowing, and the Concordance, 40,000 cycles old and certain of so many things, had to begin again from a question it had never thought to ask. What does a mind look like when nobody has told it what it cannot do? It looks like a woman with an empty thermos and a full notebook, asking a junior officer about the ceiling tiles, already thinking about what comes next.